1885, diplomats of 14 European powers and the United States arrived at the palace of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck with the aim of dividing Africa among themselves. A scramble for Africa. European powers had agreed not to attack each other and to recognize whatever areas were occupied by one member state. In the process of partitioning Africa among themselves, Italy was not as active as other European countries because it was a young nation for itself. It had to grab whichever country it might have gotten, and Ethiopia was the only uncolonized country at that time. Understanding the situation, Italy invaded Ethiopia without serious competition from outside.
The French had colonized Djibouti, the British Berbera, and the Mogadishu area, Italy, Kenya, Britain, the Sudan, Britain, or the British government. But Ethiopia was an independent country. And this gave an opportunity for the Italians to colonize it because they had controlled the southern part of Ethiopia, that is Mogadishu government. And they had also controlled the northern part, that is Eritrea. And they wanted to control the whole Ethiopia. As a result of this, they had to move aggressively. This was the ambition of the Italians, because by controlling Eritrea alone, they could not have benefited much. Because the resources are very limited, in fact, were very limited. And they knew Ethiopia was very rich. By rich, I mean, historically, Ethiopians exported many things, which were, including gold.
አገራችን ወርቅ ናት እንጨቷም ዛፏም ድንጋዩም ሁሉም ወርቅ ናት ምርቷ መረቱባት እንደሆነ ሁሉም ጀግና ተወልዳለች ጀግና ታፈራለች ጥሩ ምድር አለች እነ መልካም ምድሯ ያማረች ናት የምትፈልግ ስለሆነች ጣሊያኖች ፋሺስቶች ይፈልጓታል
Italy cannot understand why the League of Nations that's taken no step in the Chinese-Japanese question, that has not interfered in the Chaco troubles, is today so strong against this Italian campaign in Abyssinia.
Fano, 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 take so good, you very
Before the Battle of Adwa in March 1st, 1896, Ethiopia and Italy had fought at various battlefields, Italy to colonize and Ethiopia to defend itself. Italy started invading Ethiopia with Assab.
The Italians had tried a bit earlier their best to colonize Ethiopia, but it had to be gradual. They started with Assab, then gradually came to Massawa. Having occupied Massawa, they tried to control the highland by moving to the highland. It was on their way that Ras Alula, the then governor of Bahar Nagash, challenged them, and they had to return to Massawa. Even then, they had to try to challenge Emperor Yohannes, and had tried to come to the highland.
At that time, Italy was lucky to encroach on the highland because Johannes IV had to turn his attention to the west as Gondar and the neighboring areas were conquered by the Mahdi's force of the Sudan. Johannes went to Matama, fought against the Mahdi's force, and lost his life. That was the moment when Italy managed to occupy Eritrea.
Having controlled Eritrea, which they gave a new name Eritrea because it was Bahar Nagash before, they were not satisfied remaining in Eritrea. They had greater ambition to colonize Ethiopia. And sometime in 1894, they tried to move into Tigray. Obviously in 95, they fought against Ras Mengesha Yohannes, the then governor of Tigray, at Koatit in Eritrea, because the Italian governor of Akologozai, the Jazmach Batahagos, was not comfortable with the Italians because of the political as well as economic behavior of the Italians. He revolted against them. And meanwhile, he called upon Mangasha to help him, telling that he was under Mangasha then. It is because of it that Mangasha had to move from his capital, Adwa, to Akologozai and fought at Koatit. It was in 95, but he was defeated.
After the defeat of the then governor of Tigray, Mangasha Yohannes, Italy moved to Agame in northeastern part of Tigray. Here again, Mangasha started to challenge them by reorganizing his defeated army. But Italians continued their journey towards Mekelle and fortified at the top of a mountain called Ndayesus. Then, there was no power that challenged them. They advanced up to southern Tigray and fortified on the big mountain called Ambalage.
Emperor Menelik had realized that the Italians were coming towards his capital, and he made a national call and mobilized the whole Ethiopian peoples, I can say. His generals, wherever they were, had to come to follow him in order to challenge the Italians who were moving into the center. It was then the Italians, having probably known that Menelik was mobilizing his army, they had to remain by occupying that very strategic point.
Menelik, Agere, Tanas, Talat Matalina, Wendelig, Yonk, Suriet Hatak, Gomez Jegna, Agere Takatari. ጥቁር ነው ቀይ ነው ሳትል የኢትዮጵያ ልጆች ተከተሉኝ ብለው አገሩ ሁሉ በአዋጅ አውጀው ዘመቱበት።
The emperor, the Ethiopian emperor, a man named Menelik, was, in fact, in the beginning of the story, he's a provincial monarch. He's from a southern province called Shoa, and he's really someone who struggles to come to power as an emperor, in part by undermining the current emperor, a man named Yohannes, who rules from the north. So Menelik is a scrambler. He's a guy who, in fact, enters into negotiations with the Italians early on in order to undermine Yohannes in hopes of succeeding him. The Italians are willing to support Menelik in his enterprise, in part by giving him firearms, some which will be used against Italian soldiers at Adwa, because they're in effect sponsoring him. They think that if Menelik wins, if he topples Emperor Yohannes and becomes Emperor of Ethiopia, he'll be their man. They will have been his sponsor when Menelik comes to power. He does what I think could have been predicted. He begins to separate himself from the Italians and carve out for himself position as no longer as a southerner, but as the emperor of all the Ethiopian people.
Ethiopian army led by Emperor Menelik moved towards Ambalage. The Italians had to stay on the mountain until they were defeated by the force of Ras Makonnen, Ras Mangasha, and others. After the victory of Ethiopians over Italians at Ambalage, the remaining Italian force retreated to Mekelle because there was another fortification there.
Menelik had to pursue, to follow them, but still he could not break into their fortification at Mekelle, at Ndayesus. There too, he had to wait for some time until the Italians were finally encircled and denied access to water, which is said to have been the contribution of Empress Ahaitu. Anyways, when the Italians found it difficult to remain there without water supply, they asked Menelik to allow them go back to Adigrat, where there was very strong fortification commanded by the overall commander of the Italians, General Baratieri. Menelik allowed them to go back without being attacked, without being disarmed. Then still Menelik followed them with his army.
Ethiopian army was estimated at more than 100,000. It was drawn from different parts of the country, from south, north, center, east and west. To reach a battlefield, it had to travel long distance largely on foot, and sometimes on the back of mule and horse. So they were tired. Delivering the logistics, including food, was another headache during that time.
Minilik had gone short of food supply for his army. And after having passed Maqale, it is said that there was no food to feed the army. And they knew that had they gone to Adigrat, still they had to wait until the Italians come out of their fortification. Otherwise, it could have been very risky for the Ethiopian army to fight against an enemy which is already fortified. Then it is said that Alula, who had rich experience in fighting against outsiders, particularly Egyptians, Mahdist forces, and the Italians at the Guali, he knew the disadvantages of fighting against people who had fortified. Then he said to have advised him to avoid that fortification and go westwards in order to advance to Asmara. Minilik is said to have been convinced because of the experience of Alula and moved westwards towards Adwa.
ጀግንነቱን ያገራቸውን ጀግኖች ታሪካቸውን የሚዘረዝር የሚተነትን እንዴት እንደተዋጉ በሩር በገደል ጫካ ለብሰው ድንጋይ ተንተርሰው የዱር ቅጠል ፍሬ እየበሉ ቤቴ ንብረቴ ሳይሉ ለመጋደላቸው ዳር ደንበራቸውን ለማቆይታቸው ይሄን ነው ምናው መጻፉ ላይ እንድንረዳውና በጆሮም የምንሰማው.
While Ethiopian army was moving to Adwa, Italians realized that the army could advance to Asmara. So they came out of their fortification at Adigrat and moved towards Adwa. When Ethiopian army entered Adwa, the Italians were also settled about 40 kilometers away from Adwa. In March 1st, 1896, the Battle of Adwa began and completed in one day.
On the first day of March, early in the morning, while Minilik was attending church mass at the nearest church where he had the command post, Alula sent him a message that the Italians were coming. Minilik had to prepare and had to at least mobilize his generals in three directions, dependent on the coming of the Italians. The Italians are also said to have had three columns, three lines: right wing, center, and the left wing. It was in the same fashion that Minilik organized his army to beat the Italians back.
So the Battle of Adwa took place in the Ethiopian highlands on the 1st of March, 1896. And it was a confrontation between an Italian army and an Ethiopian army that resulted in a triumphal victory for Ethiopia and disastrous defeat for Italy. The loss of life on the Italian side, out of about 18,000 men, was close to 6,000. They had almost 3,000 prisoners. The Ethiopian casualties were even higher, probably close to 20,000 out of maybe as many as 100,000. But they won, so at least for those who survived, the casualties were acceptable.
It was the first African victory. It was the first Ethiopian and at the same time African victory over colonial powers. That has been a source of inspiration for the very people of Africa who have been dominated, exploited, and colonized by foreign powers.
የኢትዮጵያን ህዝብ ረግጦ አጥፍቶ የሱን ህዝብ ሊያገንባት ነበር ያስቡ የነበረው። መጀመሪያ ከሱ እዚህ ቦታ ላይ ባንዲራ ለመትከል የችን ቦታ ለመውረስ ከዚህ ደረጃ ማን አስደርሶት ጀግኖች አባቶቻችን ይያሉ በጦር በጎራዴ በዱላ በከትከታዱላ የገዛ መሳሪያውን አንገቱን ይያለ በማጅራቱ እየደፋ መሳሪያውን እየመነጠቀ በገዛ መሳሪያው ድል እየመታ ጀግናው ያገራችን አባቶቻችን ሆነ መቻ ያስቀርባውና የሱ ባንዲራ ደማኛ ሀገር ማን ያስተክሉት መጀመሪያ
Ethiopian army was not well trained at that time. It was rather traditional, largely armed with spears, knives and stones. But they did unthinkable, casting doubt upon white dominance. So what was the secret behind this unforgettable victory?
We have to see it from two directions. On the Italian side, it was not a just war. It was simply to grab others' country. They were rather coming to gain area. But for the Ethiopians, it was, I can say, life in the days. The Ethiopians had already long-standing patriotism. They had never been colonized. They have learned a lot from Johannes' period, that Johannes was fighting all odds. The Egyptians, the Mahdists, and what have you, the Italians. Therefore, they knew very well that. They know the cost of independence. They know what independence means to them. It was life and death. It was identity. It was freedom. And they were fighting a genuine or a rational war to them.
በተሟላ መሳሪያ ቢመጣ እሱ በድንጋይና በዱላ በጦር በጎራዴ ተጨፋጭፈው የሞቱ ተሞተው ያሉት አገራችን አስረክበውናል ለኛ እኛም ደግሞ ከነሱ የተረከብነውን እንዳቅማችን ከዚህ ደረጃ አድርሰናል ደግሞ ለትውልድ እኛን ለማስረከብ እንፈልጋለን ማለት ነው።
Our forefathers have fought gallantly, have fought with heroism, and they have left us with an independent Ethiopia that we feel very proud of being Ethiopian. It's not only we who are also very proud about Ethiopia, but a substantial part, practically a lot of the rest of Africans are also very proud, because this is the first indigenous black African victory over fascism.
As far as the battle is concerned, the mountains of Adwa are said to have played a greater role. Had it been in an open field, it could have been very difficult for the Ethiopians, because the Italians might have used their heavy armaments from a distance. But the chains of mountains of Adwa are said to have contributed, because the Italians were not able to move according to their original plan. They missed their tracks, and they were engaged not as a joint force, but separately, one after the other. And that very fighting was, I can say, even more disastrous for the Ethiopian army, because when it comes to the casualty or death, more Ethiopians were killed in the battlefield. But as I have told you, we had very superior numerical army in number, and we could have afforded to lose some and to gain the victory by the remaining army.
The victory of Adwa was a turning point for African nationalists during their struggle for decolonization, and activists and leaders of the Pan-African movement.
It's been a very historical event in the history of Ethiopia, as well as in the history of Africa, as well as even in the history of black movement around the world. Look at, for example, the black people in Jamaica, for example, the Rastafarians and many others. For all black people who feel oppressed, exploited, dominated by colonial powers, feel very proud about us, about our ancestors. So it has a very historical significance in terms of our own history as well as the history of Africa. If you look at why many African countries have similar flag, the red, the yellow and the green flag, although the shape and so forth might vary, it's because they have been inspired by the victory of the Ethiopian people over fascism.
After successfully defeating an invading Italian force, Ethiopia acquired a special importance in the eyes of Africans. It became an emblem of African valor and resistance, the bastion of prestige and hope for millions of Africans who were experiencing full shock of colonial rule.
When you look at it, I mean, the history of colonialism of Africa, or the scramble of Africa by Europe, for example, although there have been certain attempts by indigenous peoples like in Ghana or South Africa or so, there has never been the type of victory that Ethiopians had over fascism. and therefore you can see that the reason why Ethiopia is now the beacon of freedom, the beacon of independence, not only for the rest of Africa but also for the rest of the black movement in Africa, is not without reason. Because oppressed people, suppressed people have experienced colonialism, racism, domination and exploitation. Look upon us. They feel very proud, and they don't know how we have managed to achieve victory over fascist Italians. So what I really can say is that I do not have enough words to express the type of pride that people have on us.
Built into the story of Adwa, and one of them is that this is the first time that an African army had definitively defeated a European army. I mean, there had been setbacks before. The British had a terrible setback in their war with the Zulu a few years earlier, but it was a setback. I mean, eventually, the outcome was never really in doubt. This was, I suppose, for someone thinking of U.S. history, something like Custer's last stand. That it was a serious defeat, but part of an overwhelming and unrelenting process. The victory of the Ethiopians was definitive. It meant that Ethiopian sovereignty was defended, successfully defended, and that made Ethiopia the only African country not to be colonized during the period of high empire. That's astonishing to think about. It was astonishing then. It's still astonishing now. At the time, what made it especially, I think, important was that common sense in the late 19th century had it that Africa was going to suffer the fate that the Americas suffered, that they would be colonized and populated by Europeans. And Adwa, in a very dramatic fashion, put that scenario into doubt.
The victory of Adwa has major historical significance in the world history. Respecting the sovereignty of other countries, standing for its freedom, and working together are some of the lessons that Adwa gave to the world.
For the black people it was a hope. For the white man it was a threat. After Adwa, the Europeans realized that they could not have defeated the Ethiopians in battlefield. Immediately after the Battle of Adwa, in the same year the Italians started to negotiate with the Ethiopians, recognizing the independence of Ethiopia. It was sometime in October that they signed a treaty in order to release their prisoners of war. And Ethiopia by then was recognized as an independent by the first #1 enemy. Following this, the British, who had also interest in the Horn of Africa, had to realize the independence of Ethiopia and opened their legations here in Addis Ababa. Similarly, the French did, because the French had also interest in the Horn of Africa. They had to sign, they had to open their legation. After a year, they started even to demarcate their boundaries, recognizing the independence of Ethiopia. They designated, or they made an international boundary between their countries, between their colonies and the independent Ethiopia. Because they knew that the Italians tried their best, were armed, but they could not do that, and others did not want to take this risk. And it became very important lesson for the European powers, but very important hope for the other Africans who were suffering from colonization and attack.
We are living in an unfair world. No doubt about that. There are forces, groups and actors in the world who still continue to dominate the rest of the world, militarily, economically, politically, institutionally and otherwise. But we also have, as people of developing countries, and particularly Ethiopians, who have a very heroic history and a very glorious people. I have tremendous respect for the people of Ethiopia. And therefore, it is at the end of the day, it is the will of the people to defend themselves from foreign rule, to basically defeat all foreign powers who continue to dominate them. That really matters. It is the will of the people that's more important.
Here in Ethiopia, the victory of Adwa remembered every year. But at international level, the day is not well remembered and celebrated. Since Adwa has huge international significance, more has to be done to introduce it to the entire world.
You should understand that many people, particularly the former colonial powers, they do not want to capitalize on that, on the Battle of Adwa. It is we who should promote the significance, who should basically expand or basically market, I can say, or promote the significance of Adwa, not only to Ethiopians, but also to Africans and the rest of the black world. I mean, don't forget that there are so many black people in Latin America as well. So I do not think we have done enough in order to promote the significance of the Battle of Adwa to Ethiopians, as well to Africans, as well as to the rest of the world.
Fano, 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 teku so sinegud, kebarilindena, lefte gadai, fano de mekanya, ereto barut, yambaru, setolena fa.